Hey everybody, Mikki here. You're listening to Wikipedia, and this week on the podcast, I bring back Dr. Philip Prins, who is a researcher and expert in exercise metabolism, about a new paper examining one of the most widely accepted ideas in sports nutrition, the role of carbohydrate in endurance performance. For decades, the dominant narrative has been that muscle glycogen depletion is the primary cause of fatigue during prolonged exercise, and that high carbohydrate intake is essential for sustaining that performance. But Dr. Prins and his colleagues revisit the evidence and ask the deeper question: is that explanation actually supported by the data? And in this conversation, which I'm super excited to bring to you, we explore the physiology of fatigue, the often overlooked role of blood glucose and liver glycogen, and the phenomenon of exercise-induced hypoglycaemia as a potential driver of performance limitation. We also discuss how relatively small amounts of carbohydrate can improve performance, why higher intakes don't always translate into better outcomes, and what this means for current high carbohydrate fueling recommendations. Along the way, we unpack fat oxidation in low-carbohydrate-adapted athletes, the importance of individual metabolic differences, and whether fueling strategies for endurance athletes may need to be far more individualized than current guidelines suggest. This is a fascinating discussion that challenges these long-held assumptions about carbohydrate, fatigue, and how athletes should actually fuel for performance. And if you recall, last time I spoke to Philip, which was last year, episode 348, Philip did allude to this new review paper that looked at over 600 papers and really draws together the evidence. And this is that paper that we're chatting about today. So this conversation, I feel, is a long time coming and definitely ruffled some feathers in the sports nutrition world. For those of you unfamiliar with Philip or haven't yet listened to his previous episodes, that's episode 190 and episode 348. I've linked them in the show notes. Dr. Philip Prins is an associate professor of exercise science, and he earned a Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology as well as a Master of Science in Exercise Science from Georgia Southern University and a PhD in Exercise Physiology from the University of Pittsburgh. His research focuses on, among other things, the practical impact of lifestyle on metabolism and how metabolism impacts health, disease, and performance outcomes. Among his many areas of expertise are nutritional ketosis, metabolic responses to exercise, and sports nutrition. And I have links to Philip's academic page, his ResearchGate page, and also the study that we're chatting about today, the review that was authored by Philip alongside lead author Professor Tim Noakes and Dr. Andrew Kutnick, who is also a former guest on the show, amongst others. So if you're interested in anything related to sports nutrition or health and metabolism, I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Before we crack on into it, though, I would like to remind you that the best way to support this podcast is to hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast listening platform. And that increases the visibility of Wikipedia in amongst literally thousands of other podcasts out there. So more people get to hear from the guests that I have on the show, like Dr. Philip Prins. All right, guys, enjoy this conversation. Alrighty. Philip, thank you so much for speaking to me this morning for the third time, actually, on my podcast, which is outside of some of my good friends. There are very few guests I've had on 3 times. It's just because you continue to release research, which I think is so important, and it does seem to fly in the face of what most people understand. So I'm so pleased to get the opportunity to chat to you.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me back again.
You are welcome. And I was saying to you just before we kicked off that, like, your tome of a paper, like I printed it out and was reading through it. It is like massive. It's like a thesis. It is like one of the 3 things that has blown up the internet over the last month. 2026 has really started off with a bang.
Yeah, no, I'm glad there is such a significant interest in that paper. I mean, you never know, right? When you do a study, or in this case, a massive review, how much interest there will actually be. I mean, you can hope that other people would also be interested in your work. But yeah, I mean, we think this is quite significant, and much of the praise goes to Professor Tim Noakes, since he was the lead author, and he was the person who spent most of his time working on that big review paper that was just published a couple of weeks ago in the journal Endocrine Reviews. Right, he's a special person because it takes a special person to review about 600 studies. So if you go to the actual paper and go to the references, it's really the most comprehensive piece of work as it pertains to carbohydrate supplementation and performance and metabolism that has ever been done and published. I mean, it took about 4 or 5 years to actually look comprehensively at hundreds of studies. I mean, over 160 of them are just purely performance-based studies. So it's over the last 100 years. So this a century of literature has been carefully evaluated in this latest publication.
And I find it so interesting, and I've got like a lot of questions that hopefully we'll get to a lot of them just to sort of lay it out. And of course, I will put a link to the paper in the show notes for people to be able to read themselves. But what I find fascinating, Philip, is just the reaction from so many people who feel like it's almost like told them that you've told a whole religious group that their God isn't real. I don't know, like there's so much pushback. And I do wonder how much of the pushback comes from a misinterpretation of what they think the paper is saying. Because like a lot of the feedback that I've seen is like, you're saying that carbs, I don't know, that carbs don't help performance. And then they've listed athletes and papers and stuff which clearly show there's some performance benefits. So is there a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of what the paper is actually trying to show?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously once the paper went live, a couple of weeks ago, I mean, there was significant, interest, especially if you go on social media. So our colleague Andrew Kutnick did an amazing job at putting all the different posts together and just making sure to kind of maximize the reach of the paper. And obviously, there's been the response has been very favorable, right, from most individuals. But yeah, as you mentioned, sure. I mean, there are obviously definitely some who have different views and opinions, right, on the topic. I think a lot of it goes to people actually not reading the paper. Right, so kind of just that visceral response, and it is contradicting their own beliefs as it pertains to sports nutrition or just maybe nutrition in general, and so saying all kinds of silly things without actually reading the paper. So I think anybody who maybe have different views or opinions on the paper, the first thing you should do is probably read the paper. That would be helpful. But yeah, I mean, it's the paper is ultimately, if you do read it, if you do understand what we are saying, we are proposing a paradigm shift, right? And those aren't easy, right? When you're proposing a paradigm shift, a completely different way that you're viewing a specific topic, in this case, sports nutrition, that's not easy for a lot of people to accept.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And Andrew, I think, did like an amazing job of fielding a lot of the I guess objections to maybe the premise of the paper or what people thought the paper was about. But also, I mean, he's very good also at saying, look, this has generated a lot of really good discussion as well. And I think that's what these papers are designed to do, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, at least from what I saw a little bit on social media, not that I spent a large amount of time there, but I did see a lot of discussion as regards to diet superiority, right? This whole idea about low carb and high carb diets, and it's like, well, hang on, I don't think the paper really touched on that topic that much. It was not like it's a review. It's not a meta-analysis looking at low carb and high carb diets, right? And which one is results in more superior athletic performance. So for some reason, the conversation ended up steering in that particular direction. Maybe because of some people assumed, right, these are the authors who typically do this type of research, so therefore the paper must be on this particular topic. So yeah, that's if you get the paper, or even if you take it, because it's too long and you don't want to read the whole thing, and you put it into ChatGTP or whatever AI system you want to use, like, it's not about diet per se. This is not
Yes.
necessarily about which low carb or high carb diet is ultimately going to improve performance. I mean, we can have those conversations since we've done those studies, but it does present ultimately a paradigm shift in terms of the way we view nutrition, sports nutrition in general, especially fueling strategies during exercise, and and is it best to fuel the muscle with carbohydrate, right? Or is it better to fuel the liver, right, with carbohydrate? Is fatigue more, is it more centrally mediated? Is it more peripherally mediated?
Those are the questions that that the paper is sort of more designed to answer, isn't it? To review.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So Philip, then actually, and I guess that does bring me to my first question. So people are, out there saying that you guys are suggesting that you don't need to have 150 grams of carbs an hour, or it's going to hinder performance, it's going to harm performance, or whatever. But what is the main question you are actually trying to answer with the review?
Yeah, I mean, the core question is really, right, does carbohydrate improve, especially endurance performance, by supplying the muscle just with more fuel, right? So what we term the large glucose fuel, or by rather preventing exercise-induced hypoglycaemia, right? The small glucose pool, right? The glucose that's in the blood and the liver. I mean, that's really the core question here, and the motivation is, right, decades of studies that report hypoglycemia at exhaustion, yet interpretations focus almost entirely on muscle glycogen. And basically, if you go look at our if I were to kind of just back it up a little bit, our research over the last 10 plus years has focused on models, has focused on mechanisms. And this goes back to this other question that you were asking, right? About the paper and how people are viewing and interpreting the paper, and maybe some misconceptions there. Because a lot of times when people are looking at this type of work, they're just looking at maybe, what did the diet do? When instead looking at mechanisms, right? Because ultimately, what we've done over the last 10 years, we've used different dietary approaches to study different mechanisms and different models. And obviously, especially in the field, in this field of exercise science and sports nutrition, we know that there's this very high carbohydrate mentality. But that goes back to different models and mechanisms. So obviously, in some of the previous podcasts that I've been on with you, we've talked about some of those different mechanisms and models, especially the crossover concept, right? Or this whole glycogen-centric view of exercise performance, right? This belief that muscle glycogen is obligatory, is essential when it comes to especially endurance exercise performance. So those two models, right? One of them, the crossover concept, is basically saying that carbohydrate is essential for your higher intensity exercise performance. But then the other one, right, muscle glycogen, we go, well, that's obligatory, especially for your longer duration exercise performance, because once your muscle glycogen gets too low, then your fatigue, there's fatiguing symptoms goes up, and you get tired, and you want to slow down or stop there as a result. So actually, what we've done over the last 10 years is we've studied these different models, right? We've done studies where we specifically put athletes, right, on a low carbohydrate, on a ketogenic diet. We increase fat oxidation. So that's the idea. We're purposely significantly increasing rates of fat oxidation by putting athletes on these diets and then seeing, well, is it now possible that they can perform high intensity exercise? We've done 5 kilometer time trials, we've done 1 mile time trials, we've done repeated sprints, all of them well above the crossover point, right? Crossover point is usually about 60% for of VO2 max for most athletes. So all those studies have gone well above that, and we've shown performance is not impaired, meaning fat is not a inferior metabolic fuel. It is able to actually support higher intensity exercise performance, right? It's able to shift that crossover point to the right. And then we've also done studies looking, or more challenging, this more glycogen-centric view of exercise performance, right? Because all that you, basically what you're doing there is, again, now you're putting athletes on a low-carb diet, but because that is going to lower their muscle glycogen. So, usually, I mean, if an athlete goes on a low-carb diet, their muscle glycogen is now 40%, 50% lower in most cases. It's significantly depressed. And so now the idea is, now that I'm on a low-carb diet, my muscle glycogen stores is significantly lower. Now if I do, especially some form of endurance-based exercise, immediately right from the start, my muscle glycogen levels is going to start to go down. So which means, according to that particular model, once my muscle glycogen levels gets too low, I'm going to hit the wall, so to speak, right? Those symptoms of fatigue is going to become accelerated, and I'm going to want to slow down or stop as a result. So we've done studies where we've actually done repeated sprints, and right, because you can also deplete your muscle glycogen fairly rapidly by doing these very high intensity exercise. And the idea was there, maybe here by the halfway through third, fourth, fifth interval, now that they're on the on the low carbohydrate diet, they would have depleted their muscle glycogen stores quite significantly, and performance would have been impacted. But it wasn't. But then we also did studies where athletes are now cycling for a couple of hours. So if they're cycling for a couple hours, but with starting off with low levels of glycogen within the muscle, according to that theory, their performance should have been negatively impacted. So it's all these studies we've done over the years, looking at different models, different mechanisms, showing that once we put an athlete on a low carbohydrate diet, we significantly increase their rates of fat oxidation, or reduce their rates of carbohydrate oxidation, but at the same time, we're also reducing their muscle glycogen levels. Then hang on, why isn't their high intensity exercise performance impaired? Why isn't their more longer duration exercise performance impaired? Maybe there's something wrong with these mechanisms that we postulate, with these different models that we use to ultimately base recommendations on.
Yeah, it's super interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, as you talk about your higher intensity work and the research that we've discussed before on the podcast, sort of almost adjacent to your work or a little bit beforehand, there was, of course, Louise Burke and her research that did a similar study, but and they found there was performance detriments. And I think I was listening to a podcast this morning, actually, and apparently it was like 2% detriment or whatever in their performance. But it was still performance detriment being on a ketogenic diet versus being on a high carb approach. But their adaptation was just 3 weeks. And I'm sitting here listening to this. And so therefore what people are doing is they're like, well, Burke et al., they're very well renowned in sports nutrition research. Like they're like gold standard researchers in this field. They've been doing it for decades. If anyone's going to know, they're going to know. And for whatever reason, that's been sort of put on a pedestal of well, ketogenic diets don't work. And in my mind, I'm like, if only Louise and colleagues actually adapted her athletes for like 6 weeks. Like, I wonder what they would have felt if that adaptation period was a little bit longer, because I believe that's what you and your team did. You sort of adapted them for a bit longer and looking at that oxidation piece. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, our studies have never been shorter than 4 weeks. So we make sure that in all of the studies, the adaptation period is usually between 4 and 6 weeks. Obviously, we wish in some cases it can be longer, but it's always been between 4 and 6 weeks. And in none of those studies have performance ever been negatively impacted when the adaptation period is between 4 and 6 weeks. I'm actually working with some others on a systematic review and meta-analysis, just looking at this adaptation time period. So there's still a lot of work to be done with that, but we're just looking at, here's all the low carbohydrate or ketogenic studies that measured performance or some marker of performance at the same time. And now let's group them according to the duration, right, of that adaptation period. A lot of the old or more historical studies was just like a couple of days, right? So you have ones that are just a couple of days, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, all the way to 8 weeks, 12 weeks in some cases. And so what is when if you now put all these studies together, when do you get much more of a clearer sense of when exactly is performance much more likely to be impaired? When is performance more likely to be maintained? Or maybe is there any indication of where performance seems to be more enhanced as well? So even though it's more early days, kind of trying to do that work, it's still pretty clear that you're much more likely to find impairments in performance for the studies that are less than 4 weeks in duration.
Yeah, which, I mean, from a transition point of view, it makes perfect sense.
And I would just add there one thing, because one of our previous studies actually also looked at that, because we measured blood glucose via CGM, and then also blood ketones as well. And we found that blood glucose kind of was stabilized at about the 4 week mark, and so was blood ketones, was also peaked at about the 4 week mark as well. Again, evidence for metabolic homeostasis, and then obviously performance as well. So yes, absolutely, from a metabolic standpoint, or obviously from a just purely performance standpoint, at least 4 weeks or more seems to be the minimum.
Yeah, nice one. And then of course you mentioned the glycogen depletion model of exercise performance. Now, and you'll need to school me on this, Philip, but I remember knowing that bonking wasn't related to glycogen depletion. I think we've known that for about 10 years, haven't we? That, they've done studies looking at cyclists, and they're testing this theory that you bonk when your glycogen is depleted. And that's what we always thought we knew. And then I'm sure I remember studies that have actually tested that there, and they're like, no, actually, there's something else going on. It's not the glycogen that's the issue, because glycogen's not depleted. So is that where that central fatigue model comes from?
Yeah, well, so yeah, we can go a little bit further back. So it was really in the 1960s. So this group of Scandinavian researchers, right? They developed this needle biopsy technique, and so really for the first time in history, right, they're able to biopsy, right, glycogen that's in the muscle or liver. So that's really a landmark paper that spurred much of this conversation. That was published in the late 1960s by Bergstrom and colleagues. And basically, what they did, right, they did these biopsies in these athletes looking at muscle glycogen. And then what they would find is, for these athletes, their muscle glycogen pre-exercise, so the pre-exercise muscle glycogen levels, right before they started to exercise, was elevated. And then these guys would then exercise for a prolonged period of time. And at the point of fatigue or exhaustion, right, they would measure their muscle glycogen levels again, and it would be, well, very low. And so therefore that idea started that, well, muscle glycogen depletion, right, seems to coincide with fatigue, or muscle glycogen is an important factor when it comes to endurance exercise performance. Because the next thing they did is, well, hang on, how can we then manipulate these athletes' muscle glycogen? Let's put them on different diets. So that's what they did for just a couple of days. They would put athletes on a high carb diet, a moderate carb diet, and a low carb diet, and they would have these guys again exercise at some moderate intensity until exhaustion. And they look at pre-exercise muscle glycogen. So as you can imagine, if you're consuming more of a high carbohydrate diet, then you're stuffing more glucose as glycogen in your muscle and liver. So pre-exercise muscle glycogen was obviously a lot more on a high carb diet, a little bit less on the moderate carb diet, and far less on the low carb diet. And then they want to see, okay, well, now that we manipulated the pre-exercise muscle glycogen concentrations, now let's see how that impacts endurance exercise performance. And what they found was that when they're on a high-carb diet, higher pre-exercise muscle glycogen, and that seemed to help. That seemed to extend endurance exercise performance compared to, obviously, on the low-carb diet, lower pre-exercise muscle glycogen concentrations, and fatigue, right? Fatigue set in sooner, right? Because now you started off with lower levels, and now it's not going to take me that long to burn
Drop even
through.
further. Yeah.
Exactly. And now reach that point, right? Because that was the whole idea, is that once your muscle glycogen gets to too low levels, then fatigue sets in, right? Your RPE goes up, or your affect goes down, or like you were describing, like bonking or hitting the wall, etc. So that's kind of the history of where that originated. And actually, so even a couple years then after that, because that was 1960s and then 1970s. I know there was another pivotal study by I think it was Salton and colleagues, where they would then carb load athletes, so 3 days before, in an effort to significantly ramp up, right, pre-exercise muscle glycogen concentrations, and they would have these guys. I think that was a 30-kilometer time trial, and their performance was significantly improved in this 30-kilometer time trial. So it's all those early studies that seem to indicate that, hang on, the muscle glycogen seems to be an essential or an obligatory fuel, or the pre-exercise muscle glycogen concentration seems to be very important. But the determining factor there that seems to influence that is the diet. So we got to make sure we're consuming, or telling athletes to be consuming, a lot of carbohydrates before an event in order to maximize that pre-exercise muscle glycogen concentrations. And then obviously during exercise, we're going to be recommending athletes consuming a lot of carbohydrate during exercise in order to then the idea is a little bit different, right? Because you want to spare, quote unquote, spare this essential fuel. So all the recommendations, whether it's before, during, or after, right, consuming a lot of carbohydrate before, during, and after, is geared towards, essentially glycogen. How high can I get it before exercise? Can I spare it during exercise, or can I replenish it after exercise? And so if you read the big this review paper, you'll get that historical sense, but you'll then also understand that if you actually go back in the 1930s, there was another group of Scandinavian researchers also doing some different work, actually finding that exercise-induced hypoglycemia seems to be the exercise stopper. So that was like in 1936 or 39. There was an old study by Boye and colleagues, another one by Christensen and Hansen. And a lot of these times, these guys were just basically their own subjects. They did a lot of the experiments on themselves, where they would just cycle or exercise for a long time, and at the point of exhaustion, and ingest a large bolus of carbohydrate, and then that seems to restore exercise performance. So it's interesting how that happened already in the 1930s. And they even said in one paper, I even wrote this down. It said fatigue is a hypoglycemic symptom of cerebral origin. So that was in the 1930s. Fatigue is a hypoglycemic symptom of cerebral origin. And then a couple of years later, right, then that seems to change dramatically with the muscle biopsy technique, and then all the focus shifted to glycogen, and obviously industry stepped in, and we know what happened really there afterwards with a lot of the recommendations in the exercise science and sports nutrition field. But yeah, so now we come back to that topic basically 100 years later, evaluating all the scientific literature over the last 100 years to see, well, hang on, is it more about fueling what we term your large glucose pool, or the small glucose pool? Which one is more important?
Yeah, because I have a few, like when I'm listening to you talk about that, and it's almost like the muscle glycogen, it's like they sort of missed the wood for the trees, so to speak. So they were looking just at muscle glycogen, but did they look at liver glycogen? Did they look at blood glucose? Were they able to make those distinctions with those earlier studies?
Yeah, most of those studies are not looking at liver glycogen. I mean, that's much more difficult to assess from an exercise perspective. But what is interesting is a lot of those studies actually did measure blood glucose. It's just that it seems they weren't very much interested in interpreting the blood glucose value. So even that old study, that foundational one by Bergstrom and colleague, that was so pivotal, where they put athletes on these different diets, low, moderate, and high, and they're checking muscle glycogen, before exercise and then, at exhaustion. So yes, they measured muscle glycogen, but what most people are not familiar with is they also measured blood glucose. And so, hang on. So at that point of exhaustion or the point of fatigue, yes, I mean muscle glycogen is low, but that wasn't the only thing that was low. Blood glucose was was very low. It was definitely exercise-induced hypoglycemia. Now, this is the interesting part for that study. If you're saying that if the theory is that it's all just muscle glycogen, and then you go look at that study by Bergstrom and colleagues, at the point of exhaustion, there is variability. There is variability in glycogen at exhaustion. I mean, meaning at the point of exhaustion, sure, glycogen is low, but it's not this it's not to the same extent. Like it was a little bit higher on the high carb diet compared to the moderate or the low carb diet. So hang on. So if muscle glycogen is really causing fatigue, then why at the point of exhaustion do you find great variability? It's not it's not unanimous. Now, in that same study, yeah, exactly. In that same study, you go, what is more consistent? And that is blood glucose. I mean, blood glucose in that study for the moderate, low, and high carbohydrate diet, if I remember correctly, it was in the 50s and 60s milligram per deciliter. I mean, clinical hypoglycemia is 70 or below 70. Those guys were 50s and 60s. So that should have been the main finding of that study is, look, blood glucose level is at very low levels, right? That's exercise-induced hypoglycemia. That seemed to be the common denominator, not so much muscle glycogen depletion.
I'm really interested to know if anyone has any idea as to why that was not reported. Like, is there any, like, they just maybe, I mean, I guess they had this new technique. The biopsy
Exactly.
was the technique. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that happens a lot of times, right? When you have new technology and new techniques, and that kind of takes center stage, and then your other variables, the more traditional variables, kind of takes the back seat, so to speak. So I think that's more than likely probably what happened, and just resulted in this kind of hyper focused view and attitude towards glycogen.
It's interesting. I was listening to, I think it was Andrew talking on another podcast as well about the history of sports nutrition and how we fueled athletes prior to this explosion of sort of like carbohydrate. And first of all, just to be clear, like, I don't think that, like, I mean, I use carbohydrate when I train. I recommend my athletes do as well. I'm not up at 120 grams an hour or anything. And I'm definitely more of a lower carb style approach, maybe 30, 40 grams an hour. But even like back in the day, they used to fuel Olympians on protein, I understand.
Yeah, so if you go read the paper kind of more towards the beginning, as we're kind of more describing or detailing the historical aspects of it. Absolutely. So if you go look at the Olympics over the last 100 years or so, a lot of the focus was on protein-rich foods, and that's how animal-based foods, protein-rich foods, and that seemed to be the standard for a long time up until really kind of the 1996 Atlanta Olympics here in the U.S. That's kind of when you started to see more of a shift to more carbohydrate based foods being more highly recommended. So yes, there's you do see that, absolutely.
Philip, can we talk then about that exercise-induced hypoglycaemia before we crack on into muscle glycogen, liver glycogen. But you mentioned the study in the 1930s. You mentioned the sort of missed data in the 1960s. What other research supports the idea of this exercise-induced hypoglycemia? Is there a lot out there in the studies that you reviewed?
Yeah, I mean, our review article includes data from over 160 performance-based studies, and when we reviewed them all, put them all together, we found that close to 90%. So close to 90% of those studies showed that when carbohydrate improved performance, right? When carbohydrate was ergogenic, right, and improved performance, that's because blood glucose was significantly dropping in the placebo group. So when you notice, right, meaning if you have two conditions, right, there's a placebo group or a control group versus the other group is some form of carbohydrate supplementation, whether it's 10 or 60 or 90, whatever many grams per hour is given. The carbohydrate is improving performance by helping to stabilize blood glucose concentrations, because typically what you see in the control group or the placebo group is when you're much more likely to find exercise-induced hypoglycemia, so blood glucose starting to decrease to low or very low levels. So that's what it seems. If you go look at all these performance studies, 90% of them are clearly showing or seeming to indicate that is the mechanism through which carbohydrate supplementation is ultimately improving performance by helping to prevent exercise induced hypoglycemia. And this goes back to the whole idea behind the small and the large glucose pool, right? So the large glucose pool is just referring to your muscle glycogen, right? So all that glucose that's stored as glycogen within the muscle. I mean, you can, that's about, for typical person, about 500 grams or so. The small glucose pool, that's the glucose that's now being stored within the liver as glycogen, or just within the amount of glucose that's within the circulation. So what we're saying, and by evaluating all of those performance-based studies, it's the carbohydrate ingestion is not so much impacting the large glucose pool, but it's impacting the small glucose pool, because it's the small glucose pool that is ultimately kind of the key factor there in the sense of blood glucose regulation. So it's not so much if my muscle glycogen levels are going down during exercise. It's more if my blood glucose levels are decreasing during exercise. That is what then triggers central or cerebral mechanisms resulting in those fatiguing symptoms, not so much glycogen depletion. And that obviously, as I'm sure we'll talk about later, if you're going like, what's the so what of that? Well, there's significant implications if you think the large glucose pool of muscle glycogen is somehow regulating exercise performance or resulting in fatigue, versus you're going, well, hang on, maybe it's rather the small glucose pool. Totally, that interpretation will result in completely different practical applications and recommendations to athletes.
Well, I mean, let's go there now, because we've talked about this probably on the last couple of podcasts as well, as this shift to these higher carbohydrate intakes of, researchers looking at 90 to 120 grams of carbs an hour. People in practice are doing 150 grams of carbs an hour. David Roche on the, he's like he's won, I'm going to say, Leadville, I think, a couple of times. Did he win? I think he had a record at Western States, maybe. And apologies if I'm getting the races wrong; they all sort of blend into one, but I should know better. But on 150 grams an hour, and he attributes his success to these super high carbohydrate amounts. And so, and then in addition to that, though, if I'm listening to you, Philip, which I do, and Andrew, and of course my friend and your friend too, Dan Plews, like he looks at the research and he's like, well, the higher your carbohydrate goes, the more you're actually breaking down muscle glycogen. You're getting an accelerated breakdown potentially of muscle glycogen. Where is all that carbohydrate going, even? Because we don't even think you're oxidizing it all. So, So how how does the research actually how does that stack up to what we're seeing out there in practice now? Because it's absolutely, in contrast.
Yeah, again, if your belief is that is that muscle glycogen is obligatory to exercise performance, then the practice is about, again, as I said earlier, maximizing the large glucose pool before exercise, and then during exercise, as you were just discussing, these very large intakes of carbohydrate during exercise, right? Because then the idea is, well, instead of using the large glucose pool, instead of using the energy that's being tucked away as glucose within the muscle, I'm using, right, the what I'm ingesting, right, the gels, Powerade, Gatorade, whatever, right? That's exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. I'm oxidizing the carbohydrates that I'm ingesting orally for fuel, and therefore I'm the hope is that I'm tapping in less. I'm sparing the essential fuel because I don't want that to run out. I don't want that to become depleted because then I'm going to experiencing those fatiguing symptoms. So, so again, it's a lot that have to do with just the way you interpret it. Is it the large glucose pool, or is it actually the small glucose pool? But yes, exactly as you were saying just now. But those large, it's interesting. There's evidence, there's studies out there that shows it's actually paradoxical. There's studies out there that show, especially at these very high intakes, 120 grams or more, that actually accelerates muscle glycogen usage. Because the idea there is, or the way that would work, if your carbohydrate ingestion is so high, obviously now your blood glucose goes up, your blood insulin goes up. That significantly suppresses fat oxidation. And so the emphasis obviously on carbohydrate oxidation, a lot of glycogenolysis is taking place, and so you're using up paradoxically the so-called essential fuel that's in the muscle. So yeah, so that should be considered. And obviously, the other thing that you mentioned is, and we've published in this as well. I mean, if you're consuming such large amounts, 120 or whatever it is, it's not like you're oxidizing that. It's probably only about 50% of that large amount that you're ingesting is actually getting oxidized for fuel. So some of the unused amounts, right, is getting either stored or remaining in your circulation, or for a lot of athletes remains in their gut, causing those gastrointestinal symptoms, which obviously is a big issue for a lot of athletes, especially when they start to ramp up their carbohydrate intakes to such very high amounts. Now, the other thing I was going to mention is even one of our previous studies, because you were asking also earlier about just other studies, looked at this distinction between large and the small glucose pool. And so, and again, I think it's a great example for this kind of distinguishing factor of is it rather the small glucose pool? Is it EIH? Is it exercise-induced hypoglycemia? Is the more likely contributor of fatigue? Or again, is it the large glucose pool? Should I rather be focused on stuffing my muscle and with as much carbohydrate as possible? And I think we did discuss this also in the last podcast, but especially I think it's important for these conversations, because what we did in that study, again, we habituated athletes to high and low carb diets, and that was 6 weeks. And then we looked at their endurance exercise performance. So if you're in that study, athletes were either consuming hundreds of grams, I think it was like 400 or 500 grams of carbohydrates per day, or about 40 grams per day. So that's all impacting the large glucose pool. And then we made them do endurance exercise for a couple of hours. No significant difference in their endurance exercise performance, even though for when they were consuming the low carb diet, right, their large glucose pool would have been obviously much lower. compared to on the high carbohydrate diet. So again, how could it be? So just another clear example there. How could it be about the large glucose pool if you can clearly manipulate that and yet you don't see any meaningful impacts on physical performance? So we did that, but then we also looked, okay, well, now let's see the small glucose pool. So they would do endurance exercise either on a placebo, right? So it's just basically flavored water, or minimal carbohydrates supplementation. In that study, we gave them 10 grams per hour. The reason why we gave them 10 grams per hour is because, well, I spent a lot of time in the lab trying to pilot what carbohydrate dosage can be ingested during exercise to help maintain blood glucose level, but at the same time not significantly impacting substrate metabolism, because there are metabolic consequences clearly of ingesting large amounts of carbohydrate during exercise. Obviously, as soon as the carbohydrate intake starts to go up, then fat oxidation goes down and carbohydrate oxidation goes up. So in that study was, okay, what is just the minimum amount of carbohydrate we can give these athletes during exercise with the idea of helping to maintain or stabilize blood glucose levels, but without significantly impacting substrate metabolism, right, carbon fat oxidation rates during exercise. So that was the whole idea behind that. Plus the fact that you only have about 4 to 5 grams of glucose, right, in 5 liters of blood, right? That's normal. That's how much sugar
Normal
you have in your
physiology.
yeah, exactly. And so that impacted the small glucose pool, and that extended that improved exercise performance on average by about 20%. Because if you look at that data, when they were on the placebo, their blood glucose was going down. Because the other thing that we did is we asked these athletes to come in a fasted state, meaning they were more prone to EIH. They were more prone to hypoglycaemia. They would do a 15-hour fast before they come in, because that's been shown to deplete liver glycogen, not muscle glycogen. So they're already coming in, obviously being more sensitive to experiencing EIH, and now they're they're taking water, nothing, or 10 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And I think average blood glucose when they were on the placebo was like 70 milligrams per deciliter. I mean, that's the cutoff for for EIH, compared to average blood glucose for when they're consuming 10 grams of carbs per hour was like 90 or 95 milligrams per deciliter. So a lot higher. And that stabilized blood glucose and extended exercise performance. So even just a simple study like that was specifically designed to look at mechanism, right? Is it all about the large glucose pool? Is it muscle glycogen? Is it muscle glycogen depletion, or is it rather reductions in blood glucose, or EIH? That's the predominant factor, especially during endurance exercise.
How much glucose do we store in our liver?
About 100.
About 100. So, because it is interesting, isn't it? So, a couple of things. Like I know of a few athletes who've done the sort of metabolic cart testing once they've been adapted to a lower carb approach, and what they've found is that their fat oxidation isn't that suppressed when they take on board carbohydrate after that adaptation period. Like initially, when they're adapting, if they put glucose into the system, they do suppress their fat oxidation the way that you talk about, Philip, but in practice, what I've seen, and what I don't know if you know Marco Altini, like he has some excellent blogs on his low carb approach, and I've interviewed him a couple of times. He uses a periodized carbohydrate approach where he goes very low carbohydrate and then puts it in around exercise, and he's managed to ramp up his fat oxidation levels by, like, he's doubled his fat oxidation levels and improved a lot of his health markers and his body composition. But he did a test, and he wrote it up in this beautiful blog about how he put in quite a bit of carbohydrate during his or pre-exercise and during exercise, but in his fat adapted state, he was still able to oxidize fat. So there's something about that metabolic machinery that if you can get it working, then you don't necessarily have to avoid this other fuel source. And I do wonder whether that's like a good approach for a lot of people, actually. I'm just curious as to your thoughts.
Well, we have published on the fact that, when athletes transition to a low carbohydrate diet, they're actually more metabolically flexible, because some have argued that particular dietary approach will impair metabolic flexibility, but we have actually shown the opposite. I remember in one of the first studies we had, now this is not carbohydrate ingestion during exercise, but beforehand, because we had athletes do a 5 kilometer run as fast as they can. And then when they were on a high carbohydrate diet, I think it was like 94% of their total energy expenditure came from carbohydrate. So such a small amount, right? Because the remainder is only 6% came from fat. Right? I mean, that's the kind of stuff where these beliefs come from, that carbohydrate, right? Or glucose is the preferred fuel source, especially during more higher intensity exercise. Any case, then we took those exact same athletes, adapted them to a low carb diet. That was 6 weeks, and then I did the run a 5K as fast as possible. In that case, 65% of the energy came from carbohydrate. 65% came from carbohydrate. 35, close to 40% of the energy came from fat. That's obviously indicative of greater metabolic flexibility. They were able to use now a lot more fat for fuel at a very high, because that was at 82% VO2 max. So yes, and we've shown this in other studies as well. So that's just a good example. Now, we are currently doing an interesting study where we're looking at this mythical, if you want to call it that, kind of dose response with carbohydrate ingestion. And so we're having cyclists perform endurance-based exercise, and there's really 4 conditions, and it's either a placebo, or it's minimal carbohydrate supplementation at a rate of 10 grams of carbohydrates per hour, or it's 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour, or 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So we're about halfway, because we're working. It's a multi-site design, and so we have our collaborators at Ohio State. They're basically doing part of the study. We're doing another part of the study. And we're about halfway through, so I can't share too much, but the results are definitely interesting, especially as it pertains to kind of what you were saying, and how carbohydrate ingestion, the metabolic effects that has. Now, in this particular study, all these athletes are habitually consuming a high carb diet. Okay, so they're all habitually consuming a high carbohydrate diet. That's the metabolic state, so that they are coming into the lab. And then it's, okay, now let's see how you do on 0, 10, 60, 90. What happens not just to performance, right? Is their endurance exercise performance better? Is more actually better? But then also the metabolic effects. And so just I mean, I can't say obviously too much, but just from a metabolic standpoint, absolutely. Like on the 0 and 10 grams of carbohydrates per hour, as you would suspect, if you understand the physiology, there is a lot more fat oxidation taking place. And then when you start to ramp up the carbohydrate ingestion, right, fat oxidation is going down, and now more energy is coming from carbohydrate ingestion. Now, the question which you were alluding to is what would happen to athletes habitually consuming a low carb diet, and then doing whether it's 10 or 60 or 90 or whatever amount of carbohydrate during exercise. Do those their performance somehow different than individuals habitually consuming a high carb diet? And what also are the metabolic effects? And so that's speculation at this point, because we're almost done with the one study. But again, the follow-up study would then be to look at, okay, now let's adapt these guys to a low-carb diet, and now let's provide carbohydrate supplementation during exercise. And are the metabolic and performance effects the same? So you're going to have to, unfortunately, stay tuned for that. But yeah, I wish I could tell you from the current study, right?
Yeah.
Because also, if you read the review paper, we also talked about discuss this carbohydrate dose escalation and how that impacts or maybe doesn't impact exercise performance. There's actually not a lot of well-designed studies on that, especially ones that are not funded by industry. And so, what the goal of our kind of current ongoing study was to design one of these carbohydrate dosing studies and see what exactly is happening to performance and also metabolism if you just scale it all the way up. You go from low to moderate to those high doses.
Yeah, that'll be super interesting because I do think there is. So, I have a few thoughts around it. Like someone like Marco, who is a very good. This is just a case study. It's an N=1. And he's a very good athlete, but he massively improved when he shifted his metabolic state to be one that was able to burn more fat. He was able to reduce down his carbohydrate, like all the things you would expect, Philip. This is not news to you. And he was able to race on a lower dose of carbohydrate. He still had, I think it was 40 or 50 grams, and he felt amazing. And then he just wanted, because he's got access to all these tools, he's like, I wonder what happens if I do go in and have a high carb approach during my exercise. What happens to my fat oxidation? Nothing. He was great. But then it was also interesting because he then flipped it up and he's like, I'm going to have, how long would it take me to lose my benefits of fat oxidation? So he went back on he's Italian, he went back on his high carb diet for several weeks, and he sort of figured out that he could pretty quickly reverse his ability to burn fat. But because he had built that machinery, it didn't actually take long for him to be able to go back to how he was after a period of low carb, which I just think, even though it is N=1, and you guys are doing a great job at looking at this in the lab as well, like this is just continuing to inform our understanding of using different fuel types and of time and place. For maybe there is a time and place where your carbohydrate is a little bit lower, a little bit higher, depending on the type of activity you are. For age group athletes like us, I'm not talking about elite, which I do want to actually discuss in a minute, but there is, I think there's potentially a time and a place for that, or just as much as there's a time and a place to be able to or to adapt yourself to a lower carb intake and really sort of build that metabolic machinery again for athletes.
Yeah. I mean, all I can say is, at least from our work, habitual diet doesn't seem to significantly impact exercise performance, and that's studying exercise performance across a variety of different events. Your shorter duration, higher intensity, middle distance, and your longer duration endurance events. So, because that's what we're saying there, right? Is if the habitual diet is not having a meaningful impact on exercise performance, that all goes back to the large glucose pool, and then the fact that you can manipulate that, right, by consuming a low or a medium or high carbohydrate diet. And yes, that's going to definitely impact the large glucose pool, your muscle glycogen, but it doesn't seem to have meaningful implications to exercise performance. Now, I say that, but also for anybody listening to that, remember in all these different studies that we're doing, you're ultimately looking at averages. And if you group all the data together and then compare, well, here's the average on the low carb and the high carbohydrate diet. So behind those averages are people, and people respond differently. So and so absolutely in every single one of those studies, doesn't matter what the performance outcome were, some are doing better on the low carb approach, and some are doing better on the high carbohydrate approach. But it's still important to just kind of back up there and go, well, sure, in all these studies, not just that we have done, but also others, it's still important to understand what I was just saying there. Like, yes, I can manipulate the large glucose pool by consuming obviously different types of diets, but that doesn't seem to inherently be such an important factor, not as least as it once thought to be, to impacting performance. So it's more about seems to be more about the manipulating the small glucose pool.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess I just get excited thinking about the idea that people that, shifting between different, I guess, dietary approaches is maybe somewhat helpful from a metabolic health. The same reason you're sort of interested in it from the other health perspective, like.
Mm-hmm.
And athletes don't have to be high carb all of the time to experience any performance benefits sort of at all. Which actually, on your if I'm thinking about athletes, like those who are geared more towards those higher intakes are elite athletes. Like how does, I suppose this is probably why you're getting all of the pushbacks, because people like the Tour de France riders, they have 120 grams an hour. You've got the really successful ultra endurance runners who are still having 80 grams of carbs an hour. Like, does your research, is that in opposition to what we're seeing in terms of performance? Like, are you saying, hey, Kilian Jornet is going to be great on 20 grams of carbs an hour? Like, what's the,
Well,
I think that this is what people are hearing, I think.
Yeah. So yes, I mean, I guess that's the question, right? So for those individuals who are advocating or recommending or just saying from personal experience, right? This is one of the reasons why my performance is so good. Well, is it because of is it so it's all because of the high carbohydrate ingestion during exercise? Well, how do you know how do you not know that you would also not do something similar by consuming 60 grams or 40 grams or 30 grams or 20? Yeah, like how do you was that actually tested? I mean, when it comes to performance, I mean, there's so many different variables that ultimately is impacting performance. So especially in that upper echelon, I mean, those guys right there. I mean, to what extent are obviously just genetic factors coming to play? That's obviously a big one. So you're trying to then tease out, here's our your elite athletes, and clearly there's genetic advantages maybe for them. Then to what extent is them consuming 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour doing anything above and beyond that?
I agree.
That's a hard sell right there. So but because our argument is just that, look, as soon as you stabilize the small glucose pool, there seems to be no additional performance benefits. And again, it doesn't take that much carbohydrate ingestion to stabilize your blood glucose level.
Yeah,
right?
and actually, how does this shift in terms of recommendations? I guess that's the big question, the overarching question that anyone listening to this will be like, well, what does this mean that I should be having for grams of carbohydrate an hour? Like, can we glean that from what we already might know? Like, what are your thoughts there, Philip?
Yeah. So our review, right, is saying, right, that rather the emphasis of the focus should be on the small glucose pool, and like we already discussed, right, it doesn't take that much carbohydrates to help stabilize or normalize your small glucose pool. And so the traditional approach, right, or the old model, right, was all geared towards the large glucose pool. Okay, then you're consuming a lot of carbohydrates before and also during exercise for obviously different purposes as previously discussed. But if we're saying exercise-induced hypoglycemia, if that's the primary factor in inducing fatigue, especially during endurance exercise, then hang on, then then all of a sudden what I'm doing before doesn't become like that necessarily that important, as we previously discussed, low and high carbohydrate diet, since that's impacting the large glucose pool. But then it's more so about what am I doing during exercise to helping to maintain glycemia, right, normal blood glucose levels during exercise. I'm trying to prevent, right, significant reductions in blood glucose levels, and I can do that with relatively small amounts.
Yeah.
Right.
And
that's the whole point. I can do that with relatively small amounts, as I was discussing previously in one of the studies we did. It was just 10 grams. I mean, 10 grams of carbohydrate per hour. In that study, it was, so we did, it was about 3.4 grams every 20 minutes, because that's the interval in which we administrated the carbohydrate, which comes out to be about 10 grams per hour. So that's such a small amount, was sufficient clearly to help maintain blood glucose levels during exercise, to prevent exercise-induced hypoglycemia, and extend exercise performance.
Yeah, and that's not overly different from the carb rinsing studies that they did back in the, I want to say, like the early 2000s. I can't remember when there was a sort of spate of them where cyclists would put sports drink in their mouth, rinse it around, and then sort of spit it out. Had a similar effect. Was that preventing potentially that exercise-induced hypoglycemia as well?
Yeah, I think that's different, because there's no real ingestion of the carbohydrate, but it's still kind of, both are still working through these centrally mediated mechanisms, right? Because what we're saying with EIH, right? So once your blood glucose level starts to drop significantly during exercise, and it doesn't have to be just at the clinical level, right? Because clinical hypoglycemia is around 70 milligrams per deciliter, right? So once you get to that point, or obviously lower, now it's clinical hypoglycemia. If you go read the paper, right, it's also just about that relative drop from baseline. Yeah, so what is that relative? Say I started off at 100, or hopefully not above 100, because then you're pre-diabetic, but whatever you had that baseline was, and then you drop below that 20, 25, 30 units. So even just seeing that large relative reduction in blood glucose, right, that's enough to trigger those cerebral or central systems, right? Because then your brain recognizes that your blood glucose level is obviously going down, and that's where the whole central governor theory, right, comes into play, and you're experiencing more of those fatiguing symptoms. You have less motor unit recruitment and activation. So ultimately, obviously, once that happens, you're going to want to slow down or ultimately stop as a result.
Yeah. So if someone's listening to this, and they're like, just to finish up, small glucose pools. So if I make sure that my liver glycogen is topped up, and say they're exercising in the morning, about to do something sort of higher, and not even thinking about what their habitual diet might be, but if their liver glycogen is topped up, then they've got enough on board. And that's like, if your liver carries, say, 100 grams of glycogen, did you say we reduced by 50% our liver glycogen overnight or something? Did I hear?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're going to do an overnight fast, I know there's previous studies that have shown like a 15-hour fast is going to significantly reduce your liver glycogen stores.
Yes. So if you have anything in the morning, it's really just to top up your liver glycogen before you go out for a higher intent, or for whatever exercise session you're doing. That is likely, but you don't have to put in like 150 grams of carbohydrate before you head on out the door, type thing. Not that anyone really does that anyway, although sports nutrition guidelines would have you have 1 to 4 grams per kg body weight, but very seldom do we do that. Chuck a banana in and go out the door.
Yeah, I mean, so just to make it very simple and practical, just think about how can I maintain my blood glucose levels during exercise. I don't want to see a significant drop. Right, and this is obviously now much more likely to happen for exercise that's longer than an hour in nature, any of those endurance-based activities. Then you go, well, I'm going to consume carbohydrate during exercise, since obviously that is helping to maintain the small glucose pool, right, your blood glucose levels. But I don't have to do 60 or 90 or 120 or even more. I can get away with much smaller amounts, right? Because remember, then that conversation, which is quite significant and obviously results in a big paradigm shift the way we think about sports nutrition in general. But that conversation is also important from just an overall metabolic health standpoint. So these topics and conversations is not just purely performance driven, which we have been discussing over the last hour or so, but it's also very much centered towards metabolic health, since it's not just general population who have seen significant deteriorations in overall metabolic health, right, chronic disease, etc. But we've also seen a larger uptick in metabolic ailments and different conditions and diseases also in athletes in your athletic populations as well. And we've published on this, and I think in one of the podcasts, right, we talked about that, where in one study we found 30% incidence of prediabetes. Again, that's in athletes, and we're not the only ones to have found that. So yes, the other thing is what I have personally seen in the lab. So over the last 10 plus years, right, because all of these studies are on usually endurance-based athletes, so runners. Most of these guys are doing marathons or ultra marathons on a regular basis. Triathletes. I mean, these are individuals who are obviously clearly doing a lot of activity on a regular basis. So over the years, as these guys are coming into the lab, because for most of these studies, we're measuring blood glucose. Kind of almost one of the first measurements that we get is kind of just a baseline blood glucose. So in addition to the fact that for most of these studies, they're coming in some kind of fasted state, right? It's like a overnight fasted state. So you obviously, ideally, you would suspect, because they're athletes, they're insulin sensitive, right? Blood glucose is below 100 milligrams per deciliter, 80s, 90s, or something like that. I've seen a significant uptake of these athletes in their 30s and 40s, sometimes also in their 20s, who are coming in with blood glucose values above 100 milligrams per deciliter, so meaning they are pre-diabetic. So yes, we've published on it, but just anecdotally, just spending a lot of time in the lab over the last 10 years, this has become, I think, a serious issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even in these highly active individuals, we're seeing metabolic abnormalities, and so we have to stop and think, how is it possible that these highly active individuals are seeing these metabolic disturbances? Is that have something to do with the amount of carbohydrate that they're ingesting before exercise, during exercise? Why have they been doing that? Because all the focus has been on the large glucose pool. But here we come out now with a complete paradigm shift and say, hang on, if the focus is on the small glucose pool, then you don't necessarily have to consume all that large amounts of carbohydrates for training or before an event, carbohydrate loading and all that stuff. And you don't have to consume a very large amount of carbohydrates also during training or racing as well. So that completely changes the playing field, and I think we result in ultimately significant improvements for a lot of individuals who are physically active, recreationally active, etc.
I agree, and I think I don't think what you're saying is everyone should go keto. And I think that's what not at all. It's just eat an appropriate diet, and you don't have to stuff your face full of carbohydrates. For your average age group athlete will still, won't really need to the average age grouper doesn't have to consume heroic amounts of carbohydrate. I think that's what I'm hearing, which actually will save us quite a bit of money, won't it? So, I mean, there's another great thing that, you don't have to be or even dollars.
Yeah, or even going from, right, if you are doing 400 or 500 grams, right, if you just reduce it from that amount to 200 or 150 or 100, that's already a significant improvement. Or again, if you were doing these very large amounts because you spent some time on social media and some other guy said, hey, I'm doing so great at 120 or whatever, and then you drop it down to 60 or 50, or even like we study just 10. So even just simple recommendations like that. So yes, we're not saying you have to go completely now to the opposite, to the other extreme, and you have to do low carb, you have to do ketogenic diets, or complete totally in or train or in a fasted state or anything like this. We're just kind of more geared towards, just think about it, more geared towards the I guess if anything you get from this conversation is that you have two glucose pools in the body, and they're regulated differently. And from a human health or performance standpoint, maybe the emphasis should rather be on the small glucose pool.
Yeah, no, I love it, Philip. And I mean, I definitely have a bias towards a lower carb approach as well. And I think, the more that we can sort of talk athletes off the cliff of that sort of 90 to 120 and like, hey, you know what, 60 is going to be fine for you. Like the less GI issues people are going to have, they're still going to be able to recover, the more protected their metabolic health is in the long run. So they'll be able to do what they love doing for longer. So
yeah, and I would just say stay tuned for this other study I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Because again, we need these proper carbohydrate dosing studies, right? We need to. That's obviously not industry funded, where we can clearly see, is more moderate doses clearly superior to lower doses, and are higher doses more superior to moderate doses? Right? Because ultimately, that's what most people are going to be interested in. Just if I scale it up, do I see that significant enhancement in performance? Like I care about that, but I also care a lot about just the metabolic effects, as well. But I understand obviously most people are just going to want to know, hey, if I do more, does that necessarily equate or almost certainly to improvements in performance, and to what extent? What is the meaningfulness, right, of that improvement? Is it like a 1%? Is it a 5%? And I think people will be very, very surprised when they see these findings come out, because it might not be as you might suspect. Because a lot of the guys even coming in, I mean, pretty much every single triathlete, because that study is on triathlete, who comes in, that's already the belief.
I agree.
Like they're already completely doing obviously these very high amounts. Now, obviously, in what we're blinding them, right? They don't know what they're ingesting, and it's funny because sometimes it's like they think, oh, I just did 90 grams when they were like on a placebo.
Yeah,
right?
interesting.
Or
interesting. And
they're taking 60 grams when it's 10 grams. So that's how you have to do those studies, right? You have to completely blind them to all these different conditions, and then see how they perform. And when we show these athletes the results, I can tell you right now they're confused and surprised at the same time.
Philip, do you play poker at all?
No, unfortunately not.
Yeah, no, that's probably not a bad thing, because I'm not sure about your poker face. I think you've probably told us without telling us what we need. But hey, we will wait.
We'll
wait.
We'll see.
We will see. We will.
Yeah.
Philip, please. So obviously I will put a link to the paper where people can read it in the show notes. Where else might people find out more information about this and the sort of research that you guys are doing?
Yeah, I would definitely urge everybody to go just read the paper, or again, it's kind of long, so maybe you put it into some AI system and just get here's the kind of short, the brief gist of it. But obviously, or you can just listen to this podcast, since we kind of discussed kind of at least the main findings from, again, it is really the most authoritative review on that topic. I mean, there's no other paper that comes close to that. I mean, like I said earlier, I mean, just a massive amount of studies that were reviewed. And again, the key statistic was that almost 90% of the studies, right, where carbohydrate improves performance, shows falling blood glucose in the placebo group or in the control group. So that's it right there.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can read the paper, or you can go to ResearchGate, I guess, and find some of our other work, or on social media. Again, I'm not that active, but I'm on X, or especially Tim is very active. Tim Noakes on X, and Andrew Kutnick is very active on X as well, where you can again find some great other information as well.
Amazing. Philip, as always, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I look forward to the next one where we dive into this new research. Amazing. Cheers, Philip.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Alrighty, hopefully you enjoyed that. it certainly is food for thought, right? And really interested to see these next studies come out from this group and also just engage in this conversation. What I will say is it's not like zero carbs is the answer. It's not like carbohydrate during sport isn't important, but it's just understanding the mechanism for how these work for performance. And I think that's a really interesting question for those science-minded amongst us. So, questions, comments, queries, anything of the above, hit me up. I'm on Instagram, Threads, and X at Mikki Williden, Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, or head to my website, mikkywilliden.com. Scroll right down to the bottom, pop your name in the little box, and jump on my weekly email where I share insights, research studies, thoughts and opinions that don't appear anywhere else in my weekly email. All right, guys, you have the best week. See you later.